Picture this. You're walking through the grand marble corridors of ancient Alexandria, where the most powerful woman in history once ruled an empire that stretched across the known world. The year is 30 BC, and behind the towering columns and golden statues lies a civilization so sexually liberated that it would make modern society blush. This is the Egypt of Cleopatra VII, where pleasure wasn't just accepted, it was worship, where intimacy was art, and where the bedroom became a battlefield for political power. What you think you know about ancient Egyptian sexuality has been sanitized by centuries of prudish historians and Hollywood fantasy. The reality was far more complex, far more shocking, and infinitely more fascinating than anything you've been told. Today, we're peeling back the layers of myth and propaganda to reveal the true sexual culture of Cleopatra's Egypt, a world where gods copulated in public temples, where royal siblings married each other as divine duty, and where a queen's bedroom conquests literally shaped the fate of empires. The story we're about to uncover isn't just ancient history gathering dust in forgotten tombs. It's a window into human nature itself, revealing desires and practices that challenge everything we think we understand about love, power, and the human body. By the time we're finished, you'll never look at those elegant Egyptian artifacts in museums the same way again. But before we dive into the scandalous details that would have made Roman senators faint, we need to understand the world that created them. Ancient Egypt wasn't just another civilization. It was a sexual universe unto itself, operating by rules that would seem alien to both ancient Romans and modern observers alike. The foundation of Egyptian sexuality rested on something revolutionary for its time, the belief that physical pleasure was a gift from the gods themselves. While other ancient cultures treated intimacy as a necessary evil or a purely procreative function, Egyptians elevated it to the status of sacred ritual. Their creation myths literally began with divine masturbation, as the god Adam was said to have created the universe through his own sexual release. This wasn't considered crude or blasphemous. It was the fundamental act of creation itself. Walking through the temples of ancient Memphis or Thebes, visitors would encounter explicit sexual imagery carved into the very walls where priests conducted daily worship. These weren't hidden away in secret chambers, but displayed prominently for all to see. The message was clear. Sexuality was divine, natural, and worthy of celebration. The Egyptian pantheon was populated by gods who engaged in every conceivable sexual act, from incestuous relationships between siblings to gender-bending transformations that challenged the very notion of fixed sexual identity. Consider the goddess Isis, one of Egypt's most revered deities. Her mythology includes not just traditional feminine roles, but active sexual agency that would have scandalized other ancient cultures. She was said to have reconstructed her murdered husband Osiris piece by piece, including crafting a golden phallus to replace his missing member, then using her divine sexuality to resurrect him and conceive their son Horus. This story wasn't whispered in dark corners. It was celebrated in grand festivals where ordinary Egyptians reenacted these divine sexual mysteries. But the gods weren't the only ones enjoying sexual freedom in ancient Egypt. Egyptian women possessed rights and privileges that wouldn't be matched in Western civilization for thousands of years. They could own property, initiate divorce, and most shocking of all, they could pursue sexual relationships with remarkable autonomy. Marriage contracts from the period reveal women negotiating terms that included their right to sexual satisfaction, with some agreements actually specifying that husbands who failed to please their wives could face financial penalties. The contrast with neighboring civilizations was stark. While Greek women were essentially property, and Roman matrons were expected to be paragons of chaste virtue, Egyptian women were conducting business, ruling households, and yes, enjoying active sex lives that they controlled. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages shows women purchasing their own contraceptives, visiting fertility specialists, and even commissioning erotic art for their private chambers. This sexual liberation extended far beyond the elite classes. Papyrus documents recovered from ancient Egyptian settlements reveal a society where everyone from farmers to scribes engaged openly in practices that other cultures deemed taboo. Love letters between ordinary couples contain explicit descriptions of physical desire that would make contemporary romance novels seem tame. Workers' graffiti found in tombs and temples includes sexual boasts, romantic complaints, and even what appear to be ancient personal ads seeking partners for specific activities. The Egyptian approach to homosexuality was equally progressive for its era. While ancient Jewish law prescribed death for same-sex relations, and Greek society rigidly categorized such relationships by age and social status, Egyptian records show same-sex couples living openly together, sharing property, and even adopting children. Some of the most beautiful love poetry to survive from the ancient world was written between Egyptian men, describing their relationships with the same passionate intensity found in heterosexual romances. But perhaps nothing illustrates Egyptian sexual attitudes better than their approach to royal marriage and succession. The practice of sibling marriage among pharaohs, which strikes modern observers as disturbing, was actually a religious obligation rooted in divine sexuality. The royal family was considered literally divine, and by marrying within the bloodline, they were emulating the incestuous relationships of the gods themselves. This wasn't about genetics or politics alone. It was about maintaining the sacred sexual energy that legitimized their rule. Cleopatra herself was the product of this system, likely the daughter of siblings, and she would continue the tradition by marrying two of her younger brothers in succession. But here's where the story gets really interesting. These marriages were largely ceremonial. The real power, the real passion, and the real politics happened in relationships that crossed cultural and national boundaries, relationships that would ultimately reshape the ancient world. The Queen's famous liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just romantic affairs or political alliances. They were cultural collisions between Egyptian sexual liberation and Roman sexual repression. When Caesar first encountered Cleopatra, he was entering a world where women wielded sexual power as a political weapon, where pleasure was considered a divine right, and where the bedroom was just another battlefield in the game of empire. The Romans, for all their military might and political sophistication, were sexual prudes compared to the Egyptians. Roman women were expected to be modest, submissive, and largely invisible in public life. The idea of a woman actively pursuing political goals through sexual relationships was not just foreign to Roman culture, it was threatening to the very foundations of their patriarchal society. This cultural clash would become one of the defining tensions of Cleopatra's reign and ultimately contribute to both her greatest triumphs and her final downfall. Egyptian medical papyri from Cleopatra's era reveal a sophisticated understanding of human sexuality that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. Egyptian physicians prescribed treatments for sexual dysfunction, provided detailed instructions for maximizing pleasure, and even developed surgical procedures for enhancing sexual performance. The Edwin Smith Papyrus contains what may be history's first recorded case study of erectile dysfunction, complete with recommended treatments that combined herbal remedies with psychological counseling. But the most shocking aspect of Egyptian sexuality wasn't what they did in private, it was how openly they celebrated it in public. Annual festivals dedicated to fertility gods featured processions of giant phalluses, public reenactments of divine sexual encounters, and communal rituals that would have sent Roman censors into apoplectic fits. These weren't underground cult practices, but state-sponsored celebrations attended by thousands of ordinary citizens. The Festival of Min, the god of fertility and sexual prowess, transformed entire cities into celebrations of carnal desire. Participants wore elaborate costumes depicting sexual organs, performed dances that simulated intercourse, and consumed foods believed to enhance sexual power. The pharaoh himself was expected to participate, publicly demonstrating his virility through ritual acts that affirmed his divine nature and his right to rule. These festivals weren't just about physical pleasure. They were economic powerhouses that drove trade across the Mediterranean. Merchants would arrive months in advance, bringing exotic aphrodisiacs from distant lands, intricate sexual implements crafted by master artisans, and rare perfumes that promised to unlock hidden desires. The temple treasuries would swell with donations from participants seeking divine favor for their romantic endeavors. Creating a religious economy built entirely on the celebration of human sexuality. What made these celebrations truly revolutionary was their democratic nature. Unlike Roman orgies, which were exclusive affairs for the wealthy elite, Egyptian fertility festivals welcomed participants from every social class. Slaves could temporarily become equals with their masters in the eyes of the fertility gods, while women who spent most of the year under male authority could claim positions of religious leadership during these sacred celebrations. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these festivals lasted for weeks, with entire communities abandoning their normal social hierarchies in favor of a sexually liberated alternative reality. The sophistication of Egyptian sexual knowledge extended into realms that would seem advanced even by modern standards. Papyrus scrolls discovered in the ruins of ancient libraries contain detailed anatomical diagrams that accurately depicted both male and female reproductive systems. These weren't crude sketches, but precise medical illustrations that showed an understanding of sexual physiology that wouldn't be matched in European medicine for over a millennium. Egyptian physicians understood the connection between emotional state and sexual performance, prescribing combinations of physical treatments and psychological techniques that modern sex therapists would recognize as surprisingly effective. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came from the tomb of a wealthy Egyptian courtesan whose mummified remains were found surrounded by a collection of objects that revealed the true extent of Egyptian sexual innovation. Gold-plated implements crafted with ergonomic precision, containers filled with substances that chemical analysis revealed to be sophisticated lubricants, and even what appeared to be the ancient world's first sex toys, carved from precious stones and designed with an attention to human anatomy that suggests centuries of refinement and experimentation. The courtesan's burial goods also included scrolls containing what can only be described as the world's first sex manual. Written in hieratic script, these documents provided detailed instructions for dozens of sexual positions, techniques for prolonging pleasure, and even advice for maintaining sexual health into old age. The clinical precision of these texts, combined with their poetic language, reveals a culture that had elevated sexual education to the level of high art. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of Cleopatra's Egypt: the role of sacred prostitution in religious practice. Temples throughout the kingdom employed women and men whose primary religious duty was to provide sexual services to worshippers. These weren't desperate individuals forced into degrading circumstances, but highly educated temple servants who underwent years of training in both sexual techniques and religious rituals. They were considered intermediaries between the human and divine realms, their bodies serving as vessels for divine energy that could be transmitted through physical intimacy. The economic implications of this system were staggering. Temple prostitutes generated enormous revenues that funded everything from architectural projects to military campaigns. Foreign visitors would travel thousands of miles specifically to experience these sacred sexual encounters, bringing wealth and trade connections that strengthened Egypt's position as the cultural center of the ancient world. Roman writers, despite their moral objections, couldn't help but admire the sheer efficiency of a religious system that transformed human desire into political power. The training these sacred prostitutes received was extraordinarily comprehensive. They studied anatomy, psychology, poetry, music, and dance alongside their sexual education. Many could speak multiple languages, making them valuable intelligence assets who could extract information from foreign visitors during intimate encounters. Some historians suggest that Cleopatra herself may have been trained in these techniques, explaining her legendary ability to seduce and manipulate the most powerful men of her era through methods that went far beyond mere physical beauty. Egyptian contraceptive methods were equally advanced, utilizing combinations of herbs, barrier devices, and even primitive chemical spermicides that proved remarkably effective. Women could control their fertility with a precision that allowed them to pursue sexual relationships without the constant fear of unwanted pregnancy that dominated women's lives in other ancient cultures. This reproductive freedom was fundamental to the broader sexual liberation that characterized Egyptian society. The queen's court became legendary throughout the ancient world for its sexual sophistication and political intrigue. Diplomats and merchants would return home with stories of banquets where political negotiations were conducted alongside elaborate sexual performances, where entertainment and statecraft merged into spectacles that dazzled foreign observers while advancing Egyptian interests. These weren't just decadent parties, but carefully orchestrated displays of cultural power designed to overwhelm visitors with Egypt's superior refinement and wealth. Cleopatra herself understood that sexuality was ultimately about power, and she wielded this knowledge with devastating effectiveness. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony weren't just personal attractions, but strategic deployments of Egyptian sexual culture against Roman military might. She transformed her lovers into weapons against their own civilization, using techniques perfected over centuries of Egyptian sexual sophistication to turn Rome's greatest generals into advocates for Egyptian independence. The queen's mastery of these arts would ultimately reshape the ancient world, but the techniques she employed and the culture that produced them remain shrouded in mystery and scandal even today. The full extent of her sexual arsenal and the shocking methods she used to maintain her power reveals a dimension of ancient politics that most historians have been too prudish to fully explore. So there you have it, the shocking sexual secrets that transformed ancient Egypt into a powerhouse of pleasure and political intrigue. From divine masturbation myths to sacred prostitution, from gender-fluid gods to queens who conquered empires through bedroom diplomacy, Cleopatra's Egypt reveals a civilization that understood something we've forgotten: that sexuality isn't just about physical desire, it's about power itself. The marble corridors of Alexandria have long since crumbled, but the lessons carved into those temple walls echo still. While other ancient cultures built their societies on sexual repression and shame, Egypt built an empire on liberation and sacred pleasure. Cleopatra didn't just rule through military might or political cunning. She wielded the accumulated sexual wisdom of 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, like a weapon that could topple the greatest empire the world had ever known. Today, as we struggle with our own sexual hang-ups and gender politics, perhaps it's time we looked back at these ancient masters of human desire. Because in the end, the most shocking secret of Cleopatra's Egypt wasn't what they did behind closed doors. It was how fearlessly they celebrated the divine power of human sexuality in the full light of day.